Mother! Oh, God! Mother! Blood! Blood!
John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper, Sean S. Cunningham. These fine gentlemen arguably are considered the Big Four in terms of horror. Collectively, their villains in the slasher realm have not only survived the 80s, but currently remain a footprint in the pop culture zeitgeist. You can ask any person of any age who Freddy Krueger is, and they'll know, even if they haven't seen the movie. But even before the Big Four, the world had another master of suspense, the grandfather of horror, if you will, Alfred Hitchcock. Throughout his career, the man conjured up classic after classic, with thrillers like Rear Window, Vertigo, and even smaller fare like Rope. He knew how to grip a viewer and shake them to their core. Sure, these could all be considered thrillers, but in the summer of 1960, he introduced us to one of the greatest slasher villains of all time in Psycho. If you're watching this video, it's pretty safe to assume that you already know the twist of this tale of a boy and his mother. If not, the flick is over 60 years old, so let's just say that the spoiler embargo is lifted. The reveal of Norman Bates being a crazed madman is one for the ages, and no matter how many times I see it, it's just as gripping. His character was primed for another immediate sequel, but it just goes to show that you don't need to sequelize everything if the film is perfect as is. However, in 1983, Hitchcock's student Richard Franklin delivered a sequel 23 years in the making. Let's flip on that no vacancy sign and be afraid to get back into the shower as we check back into the Bates Motel with Psycho 2. It was 1983. Star Wars Return of the Jedi was the movie that all the kids wanted to see. You could not escape those adorable little Ewoks. The Police had a massive hit with a song about a creepy stalker that reminded their musical subject that he'd be watching every breath you take. It was a great year for hits. As the slash-tastic days of the early 1980s were winding down, we got a few tasty morsels for frights. And while we didn't have a new Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers causing havoc, the return of Norman Bates brought a whole heap of goodness to my horror-loving soul. You see, when I saw Psycho 2, I was already well aware of that deadly shower that Janet Leigh took at the creepy Bates Motel. Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece Psycho still holds up. Whether it's the previously mentioned shower scene that made a whole generation of movie fans stink because they were afraid to take a shower, or the brilliant camera work surrounding this excellent feature, it just all works. While some may find that last lingering image of Anthony Perkins to be a bit over the top, it's become the stuff of legend. So here I am, a fan of this flick, and as well, a fan of both Psycho 2 and the Perkins-directed Psycho 3. And man, do I have a story for you. Back at my first real job in Los Angeles, I worked at a music and video store that was located right in the heart of Studio City. One day I was working at the counter and I heard a friendly voice ask if he could look at a few video games that we had on display. And that voice was incredibly familiar. Anthony Perkins was a regular customer and I had several moments to chat with him. The man was gentle and nothing like the profoundly creepy or disturbing character that he portrayed. It's something that I will always think of whenever I watch these movies. But let's get back to 1983. Having had an affinity for Mr. Norman Bates' early adventures, I was especially motivated to see a brand new Psycho. Thankfully, my parents gave me a whole lot of freedom as a young child when it came to what I'd like to watch in theaters or on cable, and yes, I was a sucker for horror flicks. Some I had to sneak and discover, but others like Psycho 2 were easily convinced that I needed to see. Especially since there was a love for the first film in my household. Talk about a great introduction to the slasher film. As a massive fan of slasher flicks, I was already excited about the prospect of seeing Norman Bates get all loony again. However, Psycho 2 did something that perhaps I didn't appreciate as much as a kid, wanting a ton of gory kills. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are a couple of solid stabbings in this flick. I mean, that knife in the throat sequence is freaking fantastic. Why Norman Bates and this story offered wasn't simply an unkillable murderer like Leatherface, Michael Myers, or Jason Voorhees. In fact, in this 23 years later sequel, the mystery remains. Who actually is the killer? Who is seemingly attempting to send Norman back to the funny farm? Norman didn't go to prison or anything like that. See, he pleaded insanity and went away for a few years. When he returns, he is treated kindly by a few choice people. However, Lila Crane isn't terribly thrilled about his release. In fact, the woman who discovered Bates' mother years ago isn't going to take the murderer's newfound freedom without a fight. The Hitchcock enthusiast Australian filmmaker Richard Franklin had every intention of remaining as true as he could to the masterful original. It began with the simple structure of a cured madman returning to where he committed his heinous crimes. Considering we'd been seeing a ton of mass killers stalking nubile victims, and they just can't seem to not trip every time that they run, this unique approach was quite refreshing. After all, how would you react if your neighbor who butchered a few people returned home after a lengthy stay in a facility? It might be a tad unsettling. Aside from the legendary Anthony Perkins, this sequel offered serious movie fans one hell of an amazing cast list that included, as mentioned, the return of Vera Miles from the first film. Robert Loggia is the sympathetic Dr. Raymond who is trying to help Norman return to a non-psycho life. And then there's Dennis Franz. If you're looking to kill off a sleazy dude who turned the family-friendly Bates Motel into some hourly rental motel for travelers looking to screw around, you really can't do much better than the casting of Mr. Franz as the creepy owner. I mean, the dude screams lowlife in the best of ways. Yet as a kid, this was the movie that introduced me to Meg Tilly, and I was smitten. The actress had already caught my eye in films like Tex with Matt Dillon. More importantly, it was the silly little PG fright flick called One Dark Night that made me excited about this charming leading lady. While Meg wasn't quite as bombastic with her character choices as her incredible sister Jennifer Tilly, Meg wasn't shy about horror flicks. She rocked my world in the cheesy yet satisfying Impulse from 1984, as well as the Abel Ferrara remake of sorts, Body Snatchers. As a fan of Meg, it was disheartening to hear years later about the terrible experience that she had on set. Miss Tilly didn't watch television when she was younger, and she had very little knowledge about the importance of the original Psycho. With a little on-set friction with her director and co-star, she had avoided the premiere and didn't actually watch the film until 2021 in a live stream. I'm hopeful that she's more accepting of the terrific relationship that she shared with Mr. Perkins, and glad she ultimately liked the film. One of the most appealing moments as I revisited Psycho 2 recently is just how impressive it is to have such a mystery play out, and not in a Friday the 13th Part 5 way. Nah, we know Bates can go a little mad sometimes.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
And yes, he is allowed to go a little mad here. Still, the sympathetic relationship between him and his leading lady is surprisingly gentle, and makes it easy to understand her transformation as she gets to know the guy. You also have to appreciate the dedication to preserving what Hitchcock attempted. All the bases are covered here, and if you're a fan of the original, that helps connect to the continuation. Considering that, at the time, we weren't seeing a shit ton of sequels to every single horror flick that came out, it was cool to see something that attempted to bring some class to the mayhem. And for the most part, Psycho 2 is an ambitiously smart sequel to a classic film. One that, frankly, felt a lot more respectful to Hitchcock's OG than the shot-by-shot ridiculousness of the Gus Van Sant experiment in 1998. It's strange to look back at this, as well as Psycho 3, which perhaps is a tad seedier than this one, as it's easy to see why this blossoming franchise succeeded before it was just a handful of horror villains repeatedly giving everyone a fright. Norman Bates was legendary in a unique way. You all may be aware that in addition to Leatherface, Hannibal Lecter had been inspired by the notoriously twisted mind of Ed Gein. The same is true with Norman Bates, especially the mother angle. After all, this flick inspired many a scary tale that delves into the darkness with its mommy issue leading lads. Maniac and Don't Go in the House come to mind. For all of you who perhaps are fans, and for those of you who really relish this flick as I do myself, the legend of Norman and his psycho issues have transcended to all forms of entertainment. Every damn year, I look forward to the spooktacular Halloween Horror Nights in Hollywood, California, and when I pass the Bates Motel, it's a joy to celebrate the Bates legacy. I get especially excited at the photo op on the steps of the house, and Norman occasionally chasing the studio tram with his trusty butcher knife. Since Psycho 2, we've had made-for-cable sequels and a pretty terrific series starring the incredible Vera Farmiga. And like most horror icons, I doubt we are done with Norman. There are many ways that this iconic character can return, yet personally, it always comes down to the brilliance of what Anthony Perkins brought to the role. It's very tricky for an actor to balance sympathy with psychotic tendencies. Yet, especially in this first sequel, the man expertly creates a sense of frustration and a desire to be better. And as he begins to head down to Crazy Town, you feel for the guy. One particular moment that really emphasizes this is a softer one while Norman is comforted by Mary. It was a scene that Mr. Perkins requested screenwriter Tom Holland add to give Norman something more than just the creep factor, and it works. Considering that Mr. Holland brought us both Fright Night and Child's Play, it is no surprise that he was able to add a few additional layers to an already solid script. Horror has always survived. Why? Well, it's a great way to deal with your fears and nightmares. Norman Bates is evil personified in a way that we rarely see, without getting trashy or overtly violent. Norman had issues, but instead of turning him into a cartoonish villain, the talent behind Psycho 2 managed to create an effective thriller that both celebrates the classic feature and adds some of the modern horror tropes that we all love. And while the violence isn't over the top, there's still good fun to be had. Richard Franklin went on to do a couple of decent features, including Cloak and Dagger, Link, and perhaps a less than stellar sequel to FX. Yet I still appreciate the care that he put into creating such a solid follow-up to a film that really didn't need it. While Psycho 2 isn't exactly on par with some of the more bombastic and wild flicks that came out in the 80s, it was a breath of fresh air for fans who were curious about what had happened to Norman Bates all those years back. Psycho 2 may not reach the heights of the brilliance of Hitchcock's take of motherly love, but it certainly can stand proud as a fine example of a legacy sequel before they were cool. In fact, I wish that other modern horror flicks would take an approach like Psycho 2. In the modern age of blockbusters and the like, this sequel remains something unique and special for those willing to discover it.
There are few universal truths. Psycho is a classic. Money buys you time, and of course,
clear alcohols are for rich women on diets.
And besides a keyboard contrarian that'll cry about Hitchcock's masterpiece being overrated on Twitter, I've always been fascinated with its 3 wild sequels, and the one I'm digging into today was the entry made during the height of the 80s slasher boom. Directed by the man himself, Anthony Perkins, this sequel bridged the gap between one of the early slashers and where the subgenre ended up. So pour yourself something nice, smoke 'em if you got 'em, and let's not wake mother. This is Psycho 3. But even if this series has settled in the rearview mirror of the genre, I'm still fascinated by the sequel trilogy we got 23 years after the original. Psycho 3 will always hold a special place in my heart. Coming out 3 years after the second movie, but taking place only 1 month after, Bates has completely lost it and has reverted back to his old ways, running the motel and fully off his rocker. The mythology has been deepened with the explanation that Norma wasn't Bates' actual mother, but his aunt. And Emma Spool, the waitress from the diner, was his biological mother. And as a man willing to make things happen, he quickly puts her in the window, making his transformation or digression complete. In his older state of crazy, Norman comes in contact with 2 characters that will shape his future and fate. A nun in a crisis of faith,
Maureen Coyle. That's a pretty name.
played by Diane Scarwood, responsible for manslaughter and on the run with nowhere to go. My man Fahey, the lawnmower man, Lapidus. The King of Kings, plays a great and over-the-top
Wayne Duke.
a sleazy wannabe musician driving across country. And both, for better or worse, well, it's for worse, find their way to Bates Motel. 1986 was a different time, and like anything iconic or important, there becomes a moment where you settle into the past and a new generation takes over. I mean, I still think Super Unknown is new, and the fact that it's almost considered classic rock makes me absolutely devastated. Psycho is historic and culturally important. Yet what makes Perkins' take on Psycho 3 so fun is that it plays in the sandbox of 80s schlock. While Richard Franklin and Tom Holland's Part 2 aimed for a grounded thriller feel, Psycho 3 goes ultra stylish with embellished performances, creative scene transitions, and a brighter and more exaggerated color scheme. We start with Norman at 11, playing normal.
Cabin 1.
Makes it kind of cozy.
Damn, dude, play it cool. Just play it cool, man. Duke is the first to cross Norman's path, instantly becoming assistant manager, helping him with the day-to-day tasks at the motel. And Fahey came to work on this movie set. I mean, dude may be the best side character in the whole series.
Said the spider to the fly.
Fahey's Duke. He embodies the excess and over-dramatization the 80s had to offer. Dwayne Duke is aggressively charming, obviously scheming, drinks like a champ, and is horny to the bone. Not to mention some of the best lines in the movie. A few minutes into meeting him, we get this absolute gold.
You could have been coming instead of going.
Yeah, I know, we're supposed to hate him, but, with any villain character that is this level of all in, I usually end up loving everything about him, and the Duke, or Dwayne, I don't know, whatever, is no exception. Now, on the other side, we have the nun on the run, Maureen, who's lost her faith, accidentally murdered a coworker, and happens to look a lot like Marion Crane. And so we follow Norman and his prude, murderous mother as he falls in love, and seemingly tries to make amends with his past. Maureen is his second chance. At this point in the series, the selling point is solely resting on Perkins' shoulders. And of course, a classically trained actor takes the role and runs with it. In Part 3, he's more neurotic and awkward, yet still possesses that, innocent homeschool charm. And it's a different performance from the sequel. And though a natural progression from it, there's almost like a cult-born follower in his mannerisms. When Norman came into the sequel, Part 2, he was a man trying to accept his past and illness. While Norman in Part 3 is barely keeping it together. I mean, his shattered reality is in pieces, and he really can't hide it. A big thing I liked, and something I want to give credit for, is Perkins' style of vocal cadence. I mean, it's fascinating here. His spacing and tone is so bizarre, it's magical.
12 cabins, 12 vacancies. Well, we've been closed for a while, renovations, but there's more life along this road than there used to be, and good prices, good service, things will pick up.
Inspired by the Coen brothers' Blood Simple, which he took this entire crew to see, Perkins wanted to style a slasher in that sort of grimy noir vibe, where everyone is a cheat and a sleaze. Mixed with the overt use of black humor gives us, in my humble opinion, the best Psycho sequel to date. But here, in Psycho 3, there's no actual comedy, but odd situations that walk the line of horror and a bit of the absurd. I mean, take the sex scene with Duke and Red, the cute bar patron. This is such a bizarre scene, it was burned into my memory. It is a permanent memory. It still stands as this strange, parody-esque sex scene. I don't get this, but it's so great. It's this entire scene that sells exactly why Psycho 3 is strangely interesting, oddly horny, and fits perfectly into the new, at the time it's the 80s, style of slasher. Let's take Red's death scene. It's as 80s as one could be. It's lit with exaggerated moodiness, a great boob shot, along with a bloody, aggressive demise. And side note, I actually love that Norman fired one creep and hired another. In Part 2, he fired Toomey, and I get it, Toomey was selling drugs, but Duke is basically the younger version. And another side note to a side note, I love that Dennis Franz is iconic for playing a tough New York street cop with a Chicago accent so thick you'd think he was a retired iron worker living in Bridgeport.
I hope he washes dishes better than he runs the motel. What are you gonna ask from a motel so far from the beaten track, huh?
But I digress. And since there is a religious theme of the loss of faith partnered with the bookending of Maureen being the new Marion Crane, we get an interesting psychology between these two characters. Bates, obsessed still with Marion Crane, sees this both as a second chance and the ultimate temptation, while Maureen wrongfully takes Norman's kindness and help as a sign from God. And this movie does some good mirroring scenes to the original without coming off tacky or forced. Like when Norman goes full mother and right before he can off Maureen, in the exact same way he did Marion, he finds that she beats him to the punch. And in her dying state sees him as a Virgin Mary and the knife as a crucifix. and her falling to the floor becomes the Marion Crane shot. This dreamy imagery is the kind of thing Perkins excels at here. And though, of course, if you read online he thinks he wasn't a good director and he didn't do a good job here, that's bullshit. I know this is his first, but I can say with full confidence that he knocked it out of the park. Psycho 3 was directed with style and grace, and hats off to Perkins for finding his voice so confidently, even if he couldn't see it. Another small detail I enjoyed that I don't think gets brought up enough, and one that adds to the overall heightened reality, is that we see things from the perspective of Norman more than ever before. You know, mother changing positions, hell, she even points in one scene. And being that the focus in this movie is he's more nuts than he's ever been, he has digressed to where there isn't a split personality but a dueling one, each aware of each other. The ending fight between Norman and Duke feels like it could have come out of the same mind of Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And again, not to drive the same point home, but Fahey owns the f***ing show.
Oh, God bless you and keep you, dear mother. Bates.
This is where you absolutely need to hate the guy, but he's just so fun. And this scene between him and Norman, this cool pink-colored room, it's just so weird, so sweaty. And again, oddly sexual.
Don't cry poor to me, Norman, with that big piece of real estate up in the hill and this thriving business. Why, if things got tight, you could just sell an acre.
And I know this is a sexual series, but I mean, the 80s vibe really changes it up. We get to tie in a few classic moments. Like I said earlier, it mirrors the original movie. Maureen gets the trippy stair kill, first being Milton Arbogast, and now Maureen Coyle. Norman Bates finally succumbs to his madness, and with a little sanity that was there all along, kills Mother, instead of, that law-breaking journalist Tracy. And so we come full circle, and Norman ends up back where he has always belonged, giving us a cool transformation in the back of the police car. The background and lighting shift, showing Norman in his most natural state. There isn't a high body count, and though this takes a lot from the slasher style of time, it's still a psychological horror flick at its core. And the exaggerated take on the material will always hold a special place in my heart. These were the VHS staples during my family video years, and all of the covers, especially Part 3, just leans into the schlock that I have loved since I was that of a small child. Psycho 3 may not be one you'd ever think of giving a chance. I get it, it's the third movie in a very long series that may not live up to the classic status of the original, but shows how to take the material into a new generation while still respecting its origins. Perkins comes out of the gate swinging with his directorial debut, and I'm here to sing its praise.